Hey everyone, welcome back for our next installment of Visions of Good Education. I'm really excited about who we've got here today. We're going to be speaking with Stephen Smith. He's currently the CEO of Intellispark, but he's done a whole bunch in the world of education, especially with technology, and he's a published author. So I'll let him start to introduce himself, and then we're going to hear all about the wonderful things that he's been doing.
Thanks, Rachel. It's really great to be here, and thanks for this opportunity. So I've worked in education technology since the mid-1990s, and mostly spent that time on student support related issues. I worked in the early 2000s with a couple folks to create a product called Naviance, which is a college and career readiness platform that's in, I don't know, probably 13,000 or so schools now.
Wow.
And then 3 years ago, as Rachel said, left after 18 years of working on that and decided to start a new business, also in student support, but focused really on more holistic student support issues and that company is called Intellispark.
Awesome. So I think before we get into kind of what Intellispark is all about, I'm just interested in what drew you initially to wanting to be involved in education and kind of these student support roles.
Sure. Well, my parents are both educators. My mom was a first grade teacher mostly during her career. And my father was a high school English teacher and then assistant principal and then a high school principal for many years. And so I felt like I was in school, regardless of whether I was actually at school or at home. And I learned a lot from them and also just really got a passion for their work through them. And then in university, I had a chance to write a senior essay on the history of vocational education programs in the United States. And it was just a chance to really learn about a particular aspect of education that I found fascinating. And then, as I said, in my career, I had a chance to bridge an interest in technology and an interest in business and an interest in education through a couple of different opportunities. And so really have enjoyed that. And also, in addition to my day job, so to speak, I have also participated with a number of nonprofit organizations. And because of the experience with Naviance, which was so focused on college access, I've been privileged to be the chair of a college access program called College Possible for a number of years now. And so that's given me another perspective on education as well.
Yeah, makes sense if you've got educators in the family that would bring you to that field. So I know that Intellispark is really focused on like the whole child. So before we get into the specifics, can you just give us kind of an overview of what Intellispark is and why you wanted to create it?
Absolutely. There's a lot of emphasis on making sure that students are ready to progress to the next level of their education, but there's often a little bit of ambiguity in terms of what we mean by ready. And so for some folks, ready means a whole series of academic indicators. And clearly, academic performance is important in schools. But I have really come to appreciate that there's such a range of issues that impact a student's readiness to come to school to learn and their ability to come to school with their best self to learn. And we created Intellispark to try to help schools more intentionally address some of those issues that were creating barriers to student success. In a COVID world like we're all living in right now, they could be seemingly relatively simple things like a lack of access to internet technology at home and a need to sort of find out what resources might be available to address that. Or there could be a family issue that's getting in the way of a student's studies. It could be a mental health issue.
Right.
But what we wanted to do was really make sure there was an infrastructure in schools to help manage student support issues at the same level that we try to manage academic issues.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think that especially right now, we're seeing a lot of students having a lot more challenges and not really knowing how to go about addressing them. And I think in my own experience, I've seen a lot of families really feeling that struggle and kind of taking that home with them. So when Intellispark was created, how are you thinking that, how are schools using it, and what does that do for students?
Well, at the core of it, we're really trying to facilitate better relationships. What we want to do is ensure that teachers have an opportunity to know their students as people, not just as test scores or grades. And so we built some very simple survey tools into the platform that allow you, one of the surveys is called Get to Know Me. And it's really a very simple biographical survey. And it's based on things that we have seen teachers do, practices that we've seen teachers do in their own classrooms, where they might have a form or an index card that students fill out at the start of the year. Well, we wanted to help share that kind of insight across the whole school so that every teacher, every adult that the student interacts with could get a sense of who they are and what motivates them. There's also another one of those short surveys that's focused on relationships and networks to make sure that students really have developmental relationships, both with adults and with peers at school, and that students who don't have those kinds of relationships can get supported in a way so that they can develop those relationships. And we really believe that it is imperative that students not just go through school anonymously, but that they really feel like there are people there who know and care for them. And we want to help provide that infrastructure. There's a lot of talk about social emotional learning and social emotional development for students, which is critically important. And a lot of times we talk about how to do that through curricular intervention. Mm-hmm. We want to do that by providing infrastructure and enablement to staff so that they can deliver some of those curricular interventions. We're not a curriculum or an assessment per se, but we're about the relationship management tools that allow people to communicate as a team and collaborate as a team to support the needs of every child.
Yeah, that's so necessary. I think about the ways in which kind of we have to restart so often with students, whether if they take like a one semester class and then all of a sudden they're now with totally new people, or when they're shifting across schools. So this is something that kind of follows these students throughout their entire education. And
it can, for sure.
And is this something that how you've seen it being used in the past? Like, how early in students' education have you seen it being used? And like, where would you like, in your ideal world, how would you want it to work for these students?
Well, I mean, we're a young company, so we don't have a whole lot of history to base my answers to that question on. But I will say our aspiration is for this to be the way that schools address student support issues on a more intentional basis from pre-K through 12th grade. We think that, as we build out this product, we'll be able to better support the needs of teachers at every level. Today, some of those tools that I mentioned, the surveys, for example, are most applicable in a secondary school context just because the students are old enough to do some of these things on their own. But we've already been in contact with elementary educators as we think about now how to enable staff collaboration and teacher to family collaboration, but eventually how to get students directly involved in an age appropriate way. We just think that there's such a need if schools have systems for compliance, like their student information system to report results, and they have systems like a learning management system for teaching and learning, they should have a support system. And we hope it'll be Intellispark.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I could see how it sounds more secondary education, and I'm a high school teacher myself, and I just think about the ways in which I try to get to know my students and build those personal relationships, and how I pride myself on those relationships, but I know that it's not going to be me for every kid. They might not feel comfortable with me or whatever it is. And I think that what you're saying would make it a lot easier, because some kids and some teachers, it's not always going to be the best relationship, but I think that that's how we could help everybody. I'm just thinking about so many students that I think, wow, it would have been great if I could have known all of this from, day one, especially thinking about things that motivate students.
Mm-hmm.
And then
there's two points that I'll just make quickly. One is we built a feature into the product to track a key connection, who is somebody that may not even be a teacher for that student that semester, but somebody that is a trusted person in the building that they can go to with an issue, or who could go to them to help with maybe something that they heard about, or to help deliver a complicated or challenging message.
Right.
And then the other thing that I'll share is just, you bring up a good point about, secondary context is different from elementary in the sense that students have 5 or 6 different teachers in the course of a day. Yeah. And the student is the common thread. So how do we make sure that, if you learn something first period about that student, that's important, that other teachers can also find that out without having to start from scratch, even on the same school day. And so that's the kind of communication we'd like to enable.
Yeah, I think that the key adult is a really important idea. Is that something that, like, although it is this younger company, that you've heard teachers or you've heard student, like what kind of success stories? Because to me, that sounds like something that, as a student, I would love it if there were this person that I could rely on. And as a teacher, knowing that, oh, if I'm struggling with the student, I know that I can go to XYZ person and they're gonna be able to support me and the student with that.
I'll give you a great example that we heard from one of our partner schools the other day, which is a school in Minnesota, about 90 minutes outside of Minneapolis, Hutchinson High School. And Dave Ellefson is the school counselor there. And he was talking about using the Get to Know Me survey. And he's a high school counselor. He had a student in his office who was looking pretty disengaged, was not having a great day, sort of hands on his head and kind of detached. And Dave was able to just reference a couple of things that he had learned about this kid through the Get to Know Me survey. And he said it completely changed the context of the conversation. The kid, I like to talk about it as feeling known, supported, and appreciated. Yeah. And this kid felt known in that moment, that somebody took the time to learn something about them that they didn't even have to tell him. And so Dave said he tried that with a couple other students the same day. He said 3 times in the same day, had that kind of an experience. And it was just so fulfilling for him and for the kids involved.
Absolutely. And is there a way that either that this already exists, or is this something that you guys are thinking about, how to kind of wrap around with not only the school staff, but families as well, kind of bridging that home to school connection?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we highlight when we talk about the product is that the kid is in school about 20% of the time. They're outside of school the other 80%. Yeah. And there's an awful lot outside of school that's important to their development. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is in the home. For some students, there are also a lot of community-based resources or government programs that are also involved. Yeah. And the student should be able to feel like their care system is coordinated. They shouldn't have to feel like they start over every time they have a new interaction. Or so, what we have designed for is the ability for the entire team to be involved. But we've built in protections for student data privacy, because we recognize that not everybody has a legitimate educational interest in all of the same information about every kid. But you bring up specifically the family, and we feel like that's so critically important, that there be a sense of shared accountability for success, and that is partly school, partly home, and partly the child, him or herself. And so we think by creating that kind of a connected system where, just a really simple example, maybe you learn something out of that survey that requires follow-up. So we have a feature called a flag that you can raise that says that this particular issue may need to be addressed. The same kind of thing if you had called your cable company or phone company because you were having an issue with service, and so they'd enter a support ticket and they'd be able to follow that up. We've set up the same kind of thing, but with a school context in mind. Right. Maybe it's the parent who's following up and saying, oh yeah, I'll take responsibility for making sure that we get math tutoring for Jason. Yeah. Well, we want to make sure that that doesn't fall through the cracks. And if you had a student who was on a IEP, then you'd have a specific set of objectives. Now, sometimes those get buried in the IEP document, which itself can be a challenge that we're interested in trying to help address. But if you have students who are not identified for special needs, then these conversations are often just a hallway conversation or a phone conversation, and there isn't any sort of scaffolding to make sure that those issues get followed up on. We're trying to help make sure that we close that gap.
Yeah, I think that I'm a special education teacher, so I think that I definitely think about the ways in which having those things that we're tracking over time can be really helpful, but definitely there's a lot of places where it's a lot to look at, especially for someone that's not a special education teacher, and try to figure it all out. I just think that that's really important to kind of make that team. And you were mentioning community resources. So does the way that Intellispark functions kind of depend on where the student is, and kind of then you have to assess what's available and how you can involve that?
For sure. And this has really been informed somewhat by my experience with a nonprofit college access program. We work in several different communities around the country, And what was interesting to me is because it is a college access program, and because Naviance, my former company, was very focused on college exploration and going to college, we had many places where college access programs were using Naviance alongside the school. But because that product was designed really with the perspective that the student was in a school being served by school-based resources, there was a lot of complexity and redundancy in trying to manage what were essentially two different views of the student from completely different perspectives that did not intersect. So when we designed Intellispark, we wanted to make it really easy that if the student were receiving support or services outside the school, that the school could invite an outside provider to have access to a limited set of information about the same record for the same kid. So that if they're seeing an outside therapist and the therapist wants to make notes that they want to share back to the school, there's a really easy way to do that. If I mentioned flags before, you had to do something that required follow-up and you wanted to assign that to the student's therapist, you could do that and they could get notified. So it's not two siloed systems, it's actually one system that's sharing one view of the student. Again, the student as the common thread. And so, but you could see that, and we don't have, because we're young still, a lot of different examples of that, but we envision that you could ultimately see tutoring programs or a food bank or housing authority that's helping to deal with a homelessness issue. There's lots of different ways that you could imagine other providers intersecting, at least for some amount of information, with the school.
Yeah, I think all of those community resources, I think there can be so much information about a student that you might not even know is out there. Like, you have no idea what other things they're involved in. I think that that's really helpful, especially for figuring out that time when they're not in the building, that so much is kind of affecting them. And when you're envisioning this as like part of your K through 12, how does Intellispark work towards that college and career readiness, and how do you see those two things kind of coming together?
Where they intersect for us specifically is around this holistic definition of readiness. So we're not specifically building out tools for exploring college programs or career programs. That's something that we think is pretty well covered in the market today with other products. Where we think that we can bring something new to the table is just a framework for recognizing that it's not enough to just have basic college knowledge. You can't just know that there are colleges out there that will admit you or know what the deadlines are. You have to think about, are you ready emotionally? Are you ready intellectually and academically? And you have to look at the whole picture. And so we've worked with a researcher by the name of Dr. David Conley, who has spent 30 years looking at this notion of a holistic definition of readiness. And so he has this framework: think, know, act, and go, which he calls the 4 keys to college and career readiness. And so we have built his instrument for assessing the 4 keys into Intellispark. And it provides a whole bunch of practical techniques that teachers can use once they have the insight from that assessment instrument to be able to think about, okay, well, how can I address gaps in the kids' ability to advocate for themselves, or to make a persuasive argument, or to connect with peers in a more meaningful way. And so that's how we're trying to approach this question of college and career readiness. And then we're leaving the specific knowledge of an individual career pathway or different university programs to other providers.
Right, that makes sense. So this is kind of helping that other piece of it, which I think for a lot of students is not really readily addressed. So
yeah, and there's a really interesting thing that David does, and some of his colleagues have done. I've seen them present a couple times now, where they will take a room full of hundreds of educators and they'll ask them to raise their hands and sort of share attributes that have helped them to be successful in their own lives. And what's fascinating about that is they've repeated this now so many times and had such consistent results, where people always highlight their ability to get along with other people, or to communicate, or to collaborate. they never mention something they learned in terms of the periodic table of the elements,
Right.
or how to deal with a complex equation in math. They always focus on these generalized skills. Not, again, to diminish the importance of specific academic knowledge, but when we talk about success and holistic success, we spend so much disproportionate effort on the no, at the think, no, act, and go.
Yeah.
When really all of the things that account for our success as people tend to fall into the other three domains.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have many, many students that will ask, when will I use this in my real life and all these things. And it's all trying to show them like, oh, this is all about problem solving and building up these other skills. But it really does come down to so many of those other skills that are so important for them. And I'm sure that while going through with all of the getting to know you and things like that, it definitely helps kind of develop a picture of what a student might be interested in as well, that kind of helps them with those decisions, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think a common thread through all of this work is it's about human connection, and it's about having the ability to really get to know, what matters to you or to me. And I had an experience with my godson a couple of years ago, which was just fascinating, at least as his mother reports it back to me, that one of the things that just made such a difference to him, and this was him at age 8 or 9, was that I had, I guess, remembered something that he told me about, something that he liked. But it was, for him, as an 8 or 9-year-old, just the fact that something about him was important to someone else.
Yeah.
Someone who wasn't a family member and didn't have an obligation to them in any particular way, just really resonated, and it really mattered. We want that same kind of experience for every kid in every classroom, everywhere.
Absolutely. And when you are thinking about what schools are like at this moment, so I'm assuming that like the need for this is coming from like not seeing that, like what kind of drew to think like, oh, we need this and this isn't necessarily happening right now?
Well, there's a couple of pieces to that. One is we ask an awful lot of educators. And when you think about a classroom teacher at a secondary school could easily be responsible for 150, 180 or more students. And so to create these sort of individual personal practices to develop these kinds of relationships, to make that an intentional effort, is hard. And also to do that alongside of meeting state standards and fulfilling their daily duties to other things in the building. So we wanted to make that easier. We wanted to make that turnkey. We also just didn't want people to have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And so, we have this opportunity, and I think this was something that we learned from our past experience, was when you start to work with lots of schools, you see patterns and you see things that are working well in some places, but that may have taken a lot of effort to get off the ground. So if we can eliminate some of the friction in getting some of those kinds of programs up and off the ground and just make it really easy, and we can keep working hard to make it easier and easier, then you can start to do some of those things at a scale of 150 or 180 right. Or more students. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that definitely in those secondary classrooms, all of those small relationships and things can definitely be challenging. And I think there's a lot of students that, I think the students that are at the very, very top performers and outgoing and, that want to make the relationships do. And then a lot of the students that struggle a lot, to go after, but a lot of the kids kind of in the middle, I think often fall through the cracks because they're not really having any problems. Like there's no need to kind of go out of the way. And I think that it's not really fair to students, it's like, oh, just because you're not misbehaving or just because you're not the absolute top. So I think that this really kind of evens the playing field so that all students are getting those supports that they need.
We hear that all the time about students in the middle versus high flyers or people who are, constantly getting attention, either if we're good or bad. And nobody should go to school and not believe that there's somebody there who cares. And
Absolutely.
so we want to make that feasible. And a lot of our experience is directly with school counselors who even have even larger caseloads than classroom teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the average of 450 to 1, some states where it's closer to 800 to 1, again, some of these administrative tools can make a huge difference if you can actually try to work through that caseload more efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would be so excited to continue to see like how this grows, just because these relationships are so important. I'm also thinking like once it's at a scale where it's used really widely, even kids that move to a new school, if it's something that's used so broadly that all that information could just be passed right along, or as they transition from a middle to a high school or elementary to middle, like those big gaps I know can be really challenging for a lot of students.
Yeah.
And having that kind of built-in support of like, hey, all your teachers are ready,
right,
know all this about you, and can develop these relationships really easily.
Yeah, because right now the only thing that really follows a student are their grades and test scores.
Yep.
And there's so many more dimensions that are important to knowing that person. So that's why we say we really want to make sure that you have your system for compliance and you have your system for teaching and learning, but we can have that relationship or support system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you kind of mentioned this before with those different pieces of success, but just to kind of give me one more sort of that broad view, when you think about student success and kind of how Intellispark plays into that, what is it that you think about as like student success?
What I think about and what really motivates me is the idea that the student feels self-actualized, that the student mm-hmm. feels like they're doing something that's relevant and meaningful to them and that's advancing their personal goals. So part of it is a process of getting to know what those goals are. And you referenced earlier in the conversation, these questions that you'll get from kids about, well, why do I have to learn this? Mm-hmm. Those are impossibly difficult questions to answer a lot of the time. And often we end up defaulting back to, well, I told you have to, or it's a requirement.
Yeah.
Ideally, if there's some way that we can figure out how to connect with each student where they are, and I'll give you another example that I had. You talk to a kid about some concept in science that may or may not be particularly interesting or relevant to them at that moment.
Yeah.
But then you get them in a different environment, and they start showing you all this enthusiasm for in this case, it was how a Ferris wheel worked. And I was walking with this, family friend, and this is a kid who was pretty detached from school, and you'd ask him, well, how do you feel? Like, do you like science? No, I don't like science. Do you like math? Don't like math.
Yeah.
But then he's like absolutely mesmerized by like the mechanical design and interaction of this Ferris wheel, and he was so observant as to the details of how this thing worked and how it was assembled. I was like, there's science and there's math in the operation of that Ferris wheel. Mm-hmm. But if you asked him if he cared about science or math, the answer was no. So it was just an opportunity to sort of say, well, did you realize? And walk him through the ways in which things that he could learn in science and math could be relevant to future engineering opportunities or just understanding the world around them. It made a difference. And again, I know we're talking about a problem where it's great to say you're walking one-on-one with a kid through an amusement park, as opposed to dealing with 30 kids in a classroom for 42 minutes. So I completely understand. But I feel like if we have this opportunity to kind of get to the point where students can just see something, even if it's not every single thing, but we can earn some trust from them because they see that some of the things that they're experiencing and learning through school they can see them through the lens of something that matters to them and that excites them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that also, I just think about really is how so many of the ways where students are saying, how does this matter? And I'll be like, well, actually, and I can't always come up with something that'll relate to every student, but you definitely see those moments where you do get it, and you're like, well, actually you would use this for this type of career or something like that. And then the kids are so much more excited and invested, and it just helps them want to be there, and then like
Yeah.
pursue whatever that course is or beyond, and then towards those college and career goals.
And I got on that because you'd asked me about success, and I don't think I closed the loop very well back
Yeah.
to the original question, but I think we're so accustomed to measuring success based on, did I get an A, or did I get a certain SAT or ACT score? And so when I say, for me, success is that the student feels success.
Mm-hmm.
The student feels like what they're doing matters to them. That's a lot more important to me than a particular test score or a particular grade. So I would feel a lot better about a student who was getting a C+, but was intrinsically motivated to learn, than I would about a student who was going through the motions and having a mental health crisis because they were feeling driven to get an A in something that was just draining them of all desire to ever show up at school.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think that intrinsic motivation piece is something that a lot of students struggle with. Especially, I spent the last few years working in middle schools, and I think that, I don't know if a lot of them were just didn't really understand that kind of drive. And I think at the high school level, you see more that they kind of know what they're interested in, so they kind of know how to push themselves, but not all the students. And I think it would be really incredible to have them start to build those skills at a younger age.
Yeah.
Just definitely help them a lot more. Well, yeah. Is there anything else that you want to add about Intellispark specifically, or anything else kind of related to this whole child approach?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground on that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's just something that I'm really excited to know is out there, and something that I really hope, like I'm sure you do, can kind of grow at that scale where students can benefit from this. Because like you said, every child really does deserve to be someplace where they feel like they're cared about and supported, and all those adults are willing to invest in that relationship. And I think that this just makes it so much simpler and more tangible, that like you have all this information in one place that then as a teacher you can kind of use at your disposal.
Well, I appreciate that. And we're excited to just learn from more experience in schools over the course of the coming years, and appreciate all the feedback we've been getting so far.
Absolutely. Well, I really, really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me today. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Of course. Have a great one. Bye.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.